In the fourth century is a back and forth between emperors who are Nicene and emperors who are quote unquote Arian. One of the most powerful emperors who is in the Arian camp is the Emperor Constantius II. Constantius II is the person responsible for the conversion of most of the German tribes. Because he was Arian, they are Arian when they come into the Roman state. And so many of the successor kingdoms that come in and take over territory in the Roman West are Christian, but they are Arian Christian, not Catholic Christian. So when the Vandals take over in North Africa, they are Arians. Visigoths take over in Spain, they are Arians. And when the Ostrogoths come into Italy, they are Arians. And we could argue about when, we could argue about how, we could argue about like what terms we're going to use to describe that fall. But the one thing we can all agree on is it's not here now. Am I concerned with the Roman political system? Well, I think you can make a pretty good argument that that's either destroyed by the Crusaders in 1204 when they sack Constantinople and dismember the center of the empire, or if you believe that the state that is rebuilt around Nicaea and reconquers Constantinople is a legitimate sort of continuation of the Roman state, it ends in 1453. Now, there isn't really a Roman state that you would recognize as a Roman state after, the middle part of the 15th century. It's gone. If you want to talk about Rome's control over the city of Rome, that gets a little more complicated because it is true, Romans lose sovereignty over the city of Rome in 476.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm with Professor Watts from UCSD, University of California at San Diego. And you have your own podcast, which I'm showing on the screen right now, and Rome's Eternal Decline. And I'm subscribed. I have the bell on. I love your content. I really think that you should have more people, more attention to it, your channel, because it's really in-depth scholarly analysis on the topic of the fall of Rome. And there's so many good videos on there that I really enjoy. So link for that's in the description. And so we're going to try to pack a lot of that information into a, hour and a half long, however long this takes, conversation, and so it's obviously that can't be done perfectly, but we can try. So with that being said, I guess I'll start off with a question for you. And the question is, and you could take this wherever you want to go, because this is a wide ranging question. And your opinion on the so-called falls of Rome, which you have one of the candidates being 476, the other one being 1453 Constantinople. But there's also a lot of other theories and a lot of different in-betweens, and it's a lot more complicated than that. What would you say for someone wondering this question, when did Rome fall? Where would you start?
Yeah, so this is an incredible question. And at first, let me just thank you for having me on here. It's a great opportunity, I think, to talk about some really, really interesting things. And the fall of Rome is one of the biggest things that every Roman historian confronts, because the one thing everybody knows is that Rome fell. This is like how we get people in our classes. This is how we get people to read our books. Like, this is what attracts people to Roman history, because it's this tremendous thing. It lasts for a really long time, and it's not there now. But then the question really becomes, well, where do you draw that line? Is it when the state stops? Is it when there are no more Romans left? Is it when the state stops being a republic? Is it when the Roman state doesn't control Italy or the city of Rome anymore? And all of those things have been put forward as possible times when Rome falls. And it depends on what kind of story you want to tell about Rome. So if you want to say the fall of Rome is when there are no more Romans, strictly speaking, it hasn't happened yet. There are still people in southern Italy who are Greek speakers who call themselves Romans.
Wow.
So, there are still a few Romans left. They still are a people, right? So technically speaking, there is one definition you can use for the fall of Rome where you could say it hasn't happened yet. There are other definitions where you could push it all the way back to like 30 BC. So if you were talking to, say, guys in the Renaissance about when did Rome fall, they would say, well, okay, yeah, I mean, there's this thing that lives on as the empire, But really, like when Rome was vibrant and important and doing really important things, like that was the Republic. And when
Mm,
the Republic stops, yeah, okay, you can still talk about Rome, but it's not the same thing. It's not as vibrant, it's just living on the kind of accumulated glory of the past 500 years. Um, so I think that the short answer to that is, what story are you telling? If you're telling a story of the state, which state are you talking about? You're talking about the Republic? Okay, well, you have a moment when it stops. But then there's another story that's a Roman story that is the imperial story. And that lasts for another almost 1500 years if you want to go to the fall of Constantinople. Um, but if you were to ask the Ottoman Sultan in 1453, has Rome fallen? He would say probably not. My name, part of one of my titles is, I am the Sultan of Rome. Kaisari Rumi, right? So I am the Caesar of the Romans. So no, it hasn't fallen. It's just a new thing.
let's
Um,
let's explore that right there. So
yeah.
Constantinople falls. Mehmed II says, "I'm the new Caesar." The Pope says, "Nah, we're not listening to that." But if not mistaken, this was taken seriously over by Constantinople.
Oh
Or
yeah. Well, and
okay.
actually, some of the popes do too.
Oh wow.
There's a man named Piccolomini who becomes pope in the 15th century. And he kind of explores this idea of, well, I will make an offer. And if Mehmet converts to Christianity, like we'll acknowledge he's a Roman emperor. And they actually frame this and like bring it to the Ottoman court and say, hey, like here's the deal for you. And of course, Mehmet is like, this is ridiculous. Like, why do I care what you have to say? Like, I just won. Why?
Right.
Why do I care what the Pope is going to say to me when he has no governance over me at all? But they made the offer. So, and then, in the 16th century, you have Charles V, who's an emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, plus the King of Spain, plus the Emperor of Mexico, plus the Emperor,
Right.
Conqueror of Peru. And he uses all of his resources to press this idea that, like, he's going to go to Constantinople and retake this, and he's going to reunify the empire. So he pretty clearly thinks that there's at least part of this empire that's still intact.
Sure.
Um, so it comes down to, what story are you telling, right? Who do you want? Who do you want to be the protagonist, and who do you want to be the villain? And you can find a villain who's going to match up with whatever kind of story you want that serves your agenda.
So when we look at what makes an empire or a republic, sometimes it's the culture. Maybe when let's say like Constantinople falls, okay, Mehmet thinks he's Caesar. But what about the church, the patriarchs fleeing to Russia? But is there people in Russia who claim to be like descent from the Orthodox tree?
Yeah, that's 100% true. Now the patriarchs, for them, actually, the conquest by Mehmet is good news. Because there had been a council in the middle part of the 1400s, the Council of Florence Ferrara, where they try and they negotiate with the last Byzantine court, the last Roman court, an agreement that brings the Orthodox Church back into alignment with the papacy, and in return, the West is supposed to send military aid to, protect Constantinople. And what ends up happening is there's a huge split in the Greek Orthodox Church that says, like, we don't want to do this. It's not consistent with our idea of orthodoxy. And so there's a famous quote saying we would prefer the Sultan's turban to, the headdress of the papacy, because at least then we can be who we are.
Right.
And so if you are the Patriarch of Constantinople, after 1453, you get this recognition that you are basically the head of this community, right? The Ottomans don't want a political head of the community, but they're perfectly comfortable with a religious head of the community. So, for an Orthodox patriarch, and even for some Greek authors, they look at this and they say, well, actually, maybe it's better. Maybe this is a better situation than having a Roman emperor, but being subservient to the papacy when our doctrine doesn't agree.
Yeah.
Um,
And the reason why I even asked that is because there's this idea of Russia being the third Rome. I don't know what your thoughts on are that. There's also the Holy Roman Empire, but what is that still just the West Empire? What are your thoughts on those things?
the 16th century, like the later part of the 16th century, is this incredible moment because you have the leader in Russia bidding for papal recognition as kind of a Roman sovereign. You have the Doge of Venice saying, well, wait a second, like we are a republic and you were able to project power. We are the descendants of the Roman Republic. You have Charles V, who's claiming that he's, a Roman emperor and doing things where he's like staging a triumphal procession in the city of Rome, where he follows the path through all of the old triumphal arches of the emperors, and he dresses up like he's Marcus Aurelius, and
Wow.
um,
Wow.
and then there's a rumor that I think is true that the French royal family actually purchased the title of Roman emperor from the family of the Paleologans, the last Byzantine imperial dynasty. So you have all of these people who are kind of claiming this Roman legacy all at the same time in a different way. And by their telling, each of them feels that it's a legitimate claim. And so when Moscow claims that it's the descendant of Rome, they pretty much have as much right to claim this as like Venice does, or as France does, or as the King of Spain does. Um, it's a claim, and it's a claim that makes sense in one way, and in another way, you just have to stack it up with all of these other claims in the 16th century that people are making. Um, so it's a very, very interesting thing. The Roman legacy becomes kind of democratized in this very wide-ranging fashion that literally extends. People are learning about Cicero and using him as a tool for arguing in disputes in Mexico, in Goa, in India, in Peru at the same moment. So this is like now a worldwide thing. On every continent, people are playing with this Roman idea as a way to assert power and claim a connection to this deep Roman past.
Wow. So that's fascinating. So, I mean, and one thing if we can say so far that we've pretty much laid out in this conversation is that the idea of Rome never really falls. But if we're gonna talk about things falling, it has to be certain things in particular, like the
Yeah.
religion, like the republic, like the way their army was, or the borders, and this are all separate things that fall at separate times. Does that make sense?
I think that that's exactly right. I mean, the one thing we can all agree on is like Rome isn't here anymore, right? The Roman state is not here anymore. It
Right.
fell. And we could argue about when, we could argue about how, we could argue about like what terms we're going to use to describe that fall. But the one thing we can all agree on is it's not here now. So then you work backwards and you talk about, well, what am I really concerned with here? Am I concerned with the Roman political system? Well, I think you can make a pretty good argument that that's either destroyed by the Crusaders in 1204 when they sack Constantinople and dismember the center of the empire, or if you believe that the state that is rebuilt around Nicaea and reconquers Constantinople is a legitimate sort of continuation of the Roman state, it ends in 1453. There isn't really a Roman state that you would recognize as a Roman state after the middle part of the 15th century. It's gone. Um, if you want to talk about Rome's control over the city of Rome, that gets a little more complicated, because it is true Romans lose sovereignty over the city of Rome in 476.
Let me jump in I'm gonna run this by you and get your
Yeah,
opinion on it. So for this to be like one of the many answers of when Rome fell,
yeah,
let me throw this at you. So third century crisis is going down. You have the East almost falling to the Gallic Empire, and the West, the Palmarian Empire, and it looks like it's all going down. And then this guy Aurelian comes up, and he's the savior basically. But anyways, long story short, let's fast forward a little bit. Diocletian cuts up the empire into four, and everything's changing at this point. He's moving everything over to Constantinople. Rome is not longer. It seems like the power is starting to shift, and now so it's not like a moment in time that you can say this day and this hour, but it seems like as these decades go by, things are changing more and more and more. They could have realized it. Could have when I think it's Galerius taxed the city of Rome when they were promised that they would never be taxed. Now I'm looking at that moment in time where the people in Rome will realize we're not the power anymore. That someone farther out there, they're taxing us now. were being taxed. So that could have been one of those like moments, like, oh wow, it's over. What do you think about that?
That is awesome. So I think that's awesome because I think there's actually something really important going on in the third century that, we know the story, but we don't tell the story. In 212, there is an extension of citizenship to everybody in the Roman Empire. And the emperor who does this is Caracalla. He doesn't really understand what he's doing. He doesn't understand the full implications of it. But what it effectively means is the empire that was effectively set up by Italians to extract or steal, depending on your perspective, stuff from all around the Mediterranean and channel it into Italy. Now, all of a sudden, that's not going to work anymore. And it takes a while for Romans to figure out that Italy is not the center of this anymore. It's geographically the center, but politically, it's not the center of this anymore. And all of these people in Syria, in France, in Bulgaria, in Egypt, in Morocco, they all have their interests that the state now needs to respond to because they are as much a part of that state as people in Italy. And the third century is really about figuring that out. And so when you say Italy loses, because Italy had not paid taxes since the Republic, it's really right in the sort of period around the Second Punic War that Italy stops paying taxes. So you're now 500 years from the time that any Italian has been paying taxes. But you realize that this empire now doesn't belong to Italians. It's not like the British Empire of the 19th century where there's this center that just takes stuff from everywhere else.
Right.
And so you're right that like around 300, Italy loses its special status and Italians become just like everybody else. The empire actually is better off for that.
Right.
Italians are worse off. But
Right.
what the empire is able to do then is create a structure that makes it so that if you live in, Belgium, or you live in Syria, or you live in Arabia, the state now is equally interested in meeting your needs and protecting you as if you lived in Italy. So it's better for everybody, but it's worse for Italy. So I think you're right that you can see there the decline and fall of a particular imperial system that's like 300 years old at that point.
Yeah.
And once you get into the fourth century, it's different. And for individuals who want to tell that story, like that's a compelling story, right? It's a really compelling story if you're Italian. It
Yeah.
is not at all compelling if you're Egyptian or Syrian or Greek, right?
Yeah. And so that brings us to, so we can compare that transformation, I think, to the Augustan term, I guess, when Augustus has his long rule after the civil wars and after Antony and all that and Actium, all of a sudden things start to change. So you can see in the first century or the first century BCE, everything that Rome used to be is now not a thing anymore. That
Yeah.
that Roman Republic where the Senate and the people rule, that's not the thing. Now you have basically a complete dictatorship.
Yeah, and that's another interesting moment because if you ask Augustus, what Augustus says is, "Oh no, that's not true at all."
Right.
Right? Like what's happened is just I am a magistrate, and yeah, I hold it for life, but I am entrusted with the management of this thing that it still belongs to the Roman people. And the word republic in a Roman context, it literally is res publica, which means the thing that belongs to the people. And an argument that I think is a really important argument that we seldom appreciate is until 1453, you never get to a point where the citizens of this state are willing to accept that the state belongs to its sovereign. To the very end, they believe that the sovereign serves the people. And that means all kinds of different things, but you can't fundamentally, as a sovereign in a Roman context, do what, say, a European monarch in the 17th century could do, and say, "This is mine by right. It's my birthright." It's never your birthright. You may be in a position to take power, but you are always serving the people, and you're always serving that state. And this is Augustus's his step. Um, he understood that, like what Caesar was doing when Caesar, the last sort of moments, last months of Caesar's life, he's exploring what a Roman monarchy under his control might look like. And it becomes very clear that people are, even if effectively one person is in charge, people are not ready to go to the point where the state belongs to that person. And that's part of why Caesar gets killed. And Augustus knows deep down he cannot create a system that's going to work that way. So there has to be this fiction, at least, that the state belongs to the people. Whereas in practice, what Augustus has done is set up a state where, yeah, okay, technically he's a magistrate who serves the people, but in reality, what Augustus is doing is running things in his, in his own way as he thinks is best.
Was there ever anybody after the Julio-Claudian dynasty, for example, that tried to really bring the power back to the Senate ever? Or is that just gone? They just never tried that again?
Um, there are moments where you see it. So there's actually a moment that I was just researching a couple days ago. And one of the things I'm going to do on the channel is every time I find these little things, I'm going to just do a little snippet.
Yeah.
So in the year 275, when Aurelian, who you just talked about, when he's killed, uh, it's a private dispute that leads to him being killed. So it's not like somebody planned a coup so they could take over for Aurelian. Aurelian is just killed. And there is an interregnum that lasts, our sources differ, 3 months, 6 months, but a long time, where the army does not want to have a commander take over because they know as soon as they proclaim one commander, another guy is going to rise up and there's going to be a civil war. So they don't, no army wants to take responsibility for choosing a successor, and they send it to the Senate. And the Senate goes back to the army and says, we don't trust you. We're not going to choose a successor. And they just go back and forth for months trying to figure out who's going to take over. And the person who takes over is a senator, a descendant of actually the author Tacitus. Um,
Wow.
and he takes over and he lasts like 6 months and he's overthrown, by the army. But you do see these moments where, people say the Senate still has this legitimacy to make decisions. So let's let the Senate make decisions. Um, but as you get further and further along, the Senate gets less and less willing to make those decisions. And I think in 275, you see this: the Senate is empowered to make a decision, and it's sort of paralyzed. It can't actually do it because it's so scared of the consequences of making a decision. And so it's not then surprising that within 10 years you have Diocletian and the Tetrarchy and this kind of move to a new structure that is decentralized from the city of Rome.
Did Diocletian move the Senate, or was it still a Roman Senate in Rome, the actual city?
There's a Roman Senate that lasts, it lasts into the 7th century at least, as a sort of functional thing. And when you get into the, after 476, one really interesting argument you can make is that you have first Odoacer, who's a barbarian general, and then you have Theodoric, who's a Gothic king, who are not Roman and are running the state, but they work really, really closely with the Roman Senate. And
Yeah.
so, so there's a really strong working relationship between those sovereigns and the Senate. And it creates a lot of problems for people who want to say, well, Rome fell. Well, okay, maybe in one way you can say that. There is not a Roman in charge of the city of Rome. So, yes, by one way of thinking, that's true. Rome, doesn't look the same now as it did before 476. But the Senate, in some ways, is actually even more powerful when it's working with these people than, say, it was in the 4th century when emperors are wherever they are and interact with the Senate only intermittently. Theodoric was not like that. He depended very heavily on the Senate to make that state work.
So that's fascinating. So the Senate never actually stops operating, even during the year 476, 477. They just keep operating as usual.
They keep going. Yeah.
Well,
And they
yes.
keep going after Justinian reconquers Italy. The Senate keeps going. And the weird thing, so one of my colleagues at the University of California at Riverside, she's explored this. And one of the weird things is the Senate keeps showing up. It's certainly not the same thing, but it keeps showing up when you look at like other political sort of upheavals in Rome. So supposedly there's a Senate involved with the acclamation of Charlemagne in 800. We don't know what exactly that is. It's almost certainly not the same thing that we're talking about, in 476 or 30 BC or 200 BC, but it's still there. There's a Roman Republic that's proclaimed in the 13th century that has a Senate. There's one in 1848. So it exists in some form, even though it's not the same thing. There's clearly a discontinuity, but the idea of the Roman Senate is so powerful that every time there's even an inkling of something happening, like you want to have the Senate involved somehow, even if it's totally weird and not anything at all like what it had been before.
Wow. And now once it becomes, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Zeno who sort of like helps the Goths take control, and then you had the Ostrogoths. And my question is, how does it, when it becomes Gothic, how did the religious structure, like the Christian, the papacy, or whatever was happening back then, I don't really know, how does that stay in put, and why didn't the Goths just convert everybody over to pagans or something? Like, what was happening with the culture during that time?
So the Goths, so in the fourth century, there is a major division in the Christian church between the people who accept the Nicene Creed and the people who don't. And the people who don't have been called Arians because their ideas are inspired by a presbyter in Alexandria named Arius. In the end, this becomes its own thing that is very, very different from what Arius was teaching. But there, in the fourth century, is a back and forth between emperors who are Nicene and emperors who are quote unquote Arian. And one of the emperors, one of the most powerful emperors who is in the Arian camp is the Emperor Constantius II. And Constantius II is the person responsible for the conversion of most of the German tribes north of the Rhine River. So he sends missionaries out. They convert the Bible into German. These tribes learn that language, but because he was Arian, they are Arian when they come into the Roman state. And so many of the successor kingdoms that come in and take over territory in the Roman West are Christian, but they are Arian Christian, not Catholic Christian. So when the Vandals take over in North Africa, they are Arians. When the Visigoths take over in Spain, they are Arians. And when the Ostrogoths come into Italy, they are Arians. And so you have a very clear sense that there are churches and probably clergy that are associated with the Catholic or the structure of Catholicism, and then others that are Arian. And the Gothic, so in the city of Ravenna now, you can see there are two different baptistries that are both set up probably during the time that Theodoric is in charge, because Ravenna was his official capital.
Right.
And one of them has a set of iconography that is pretty clearly Catholic, and another one has a set of iconography that is Arian. And so that gives you a sense of how this is probably working, that, both of them have resources, both of them have churches, but they really know where to go, right? If you're a Goth, you're probably going to the Arian church and getting baptized in the Arian baptistry. And if you're Catholic, you're probably not. And so I think when we imagine what's going on in Italy, we have to imagine that this is a pretty noticeable religious division, but the number of people who are Roman Catholic, Roman comma Catholic, is going to far outnumber the number of Goths who are Arian. And so the challenge that someone like Theodoric is going to face is he probably has the power, but he doesn't have the numbers. Like the military is going to be overwhelmingly Gothic. And if you were to do a sort of survey of the religious allegiances of the military, you're probably going to have more Goths than Catholics. But the regular population is going to be way more Catholic than Gothic. And so what Theodoric would really struggle to do is to make that population convert. It isn't really going to be feasible. And you see this in Vandal North Africa, where ultimately they do at moments persecute Catholics in Vandal North Africa, and it's pretty violent and it's pretty gruesome. And you actually have refugees who go and like form pressure groups in Constantinople to try to get the Eastern Roman Empire to invade to stop the persecutions. And we have accounts of this where like these guys had their tongues cut out in persecutions, and they'd go in Constantinople and they'd speak without tongues, saying, "You need to come and liberate us."
Wow.
And that none of that happened in Italy. And in the end, in North Africa, the last Vandal kings converted to Catholicism because it just wasn't working.
And this was all before the later split between Catholics and Orthodox. So before the split that we know of today, it was the split between Arians and Catholics. Or
Yeah, and this is fourth, fifth century, into the sixth century.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And the reason why I think that's relevant to this discussion is because I'm trying to understand what's going on in the West and how does Christianity survive Gothic control. And I guess that's the answer is Arianism, right?
yeah, no, the answer is they are Christians.
Yeah,
When they come in, they're Christians.
yeah,
And the really interesting point is the Franks, because when Clovis starts actually expanding into France, what becomes France because of his conquests, he is not a Christian; he's a pagan. And we know from the things told about his court, his wife is a Christian. There are other Christians in the court, but Clovis is not. And he's fighting a battle that he's about to lose, and he sees a vision in the sky, kind of like Constantine did when Constantine converted to Christianity, and Clovis converts. But because it's late in the fifth century, now for the Goths, it's in a sense good to be Arian because you can distinguish yourselves from Romans, right? You are Christian, but you are a different type of Christian. When Clovis is going to expand into what's now France, he's expanding against Goths who are Arian. So when Clovis converts, he converts to Catholicism. So he converts from paganism to Catholicism because now all of those Romans who are living under Arian Gothic control or Arian Burgundian control in Switzerland, they can look at Clovis as like a religious liberator because he shares their faith. And of course, Clovis knew this, right? Of course, this is a very, very strategic decision. And it's totally possible because the path from paganism to Christianity is something that even his followers would understand. The path from Arianism to Catholicism, that looks like apostasy, right? That's very problematic. And so Clovis is able, just because it's like 100 years later, he's able to take advantage of the fact that now he's fighting other barbarians. He's not fighting Romans. Catholicism is something he can embrace because all those Romans who are Catholics who are living under barbarian control can look to him and say, "That's my champion."
and I think this highlights even how much Roman culture affects even barbarian, outside invading lands because they're coming in and they're Christian too, which is obviously had to come from Romans culture. And like, because if it wasn't, wouldn't they just all be Norse pagan, Germanic pagan? But the fact that they're the invading barbarians are Christian just shows you Rome is already culturally conquered almost everything. And like,
Yeah, that's really key also because like when these people come into the Roman Empire, they know this place. They might not know it geographically, but they know its money. They've used its money. When they get into this territory, they use its tax system. In Spain, they use its laws, right? I mean, some of the documents we have of this really famous law collection that's made in the middle part of the fifth century, we have it because of Gothic Spain because they copied it and used it and they elaborated on it and said this applies and this doesn't apply, but they use that text. And so these are people who are like the image that you see. There's this really famous, well, it's not famous. I love to use it in my class because it's this image of these like barbarians who don't even stand up straight with like long beards and they're like slobbering and they look like, they're barely human and they're sacking Rome.
yeah,
That's not who sacked Rome. The people who sacked Rome had lived in the empire for a long time. Some of the people who are in their army actually defected from Rome. Like this is
yeah,
a really this is a group of people who know what they're doing. Theodoric grew up in the city of Constantinople, right? He was a ward of the court in Constantinople. So
wow,
this is not somebody who doesn't know that that doesn't know about Rome and has just come from the woods. Like this is somebody who's grown up in the very center of it and knows all about it, and knows when to assert his difference and when to use his knowledge of Roman stuff to make things work better. And they're very smart. They're not sort of slobbering monsters. They are very intelligent and sophisticated people.
And I think one of the things that highlights that how much Roman culture, I would guess you use the word conquered, or you know, became Western Europe and Asia, or and North Africa, is that the Latin alphabet is so heavily used. German, Spanish, English, they're all using the Latin alphabet. And that's a product of Rome, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. And it's a product of the West.
Yeah.
Because when we talked about the Gothic Bible, the translation of the Bible into Gothic or early German, because the missionaries came from the East, that language, that alphabet was initially based on Greek. So if you look at like the earliest pages of the Gothic Bible, yeah, it's German written in kind of Greek letters. So the fact that they're using that these European languages grew up with Latin letters shows the really, really deep power of being in the West, around these people who are Latin speakers, around these people who write in Latin. It is really a powerful force in shaping the way that they express and think about themselves. Um, and I think you can really see that by tracing just kind of the differences between where they were at the beginning and where they were at the end of this migration from the middle part of the fourth century to the middle part of the fifth century.
Now, speaking of Greek versus Latin, 1204, that year, what does that year tell us about this Roman Empire? At this point in time, can we say it's safely split in half?
Yeah, you definitely can. So what happens? So one of the falls of Rome that nobody talks about is supposedly happens in 797 AD. This is if you read materials that come from Germany in particular. So in 797 AD, the Empress Irene, who is in Constantinople, deposes her son and takes power for herself. And she is the first woman to do this officially, reign in her own name for any substantial period of time in Roman history. And if you read accounts from Charlemagne's court at roughly that time, you have accounts that say the empire in the East has fallen because it's not Roman anymore and it's run by a woman. And you can't have an empire if you don't have an emperor. And this allows Charlemagne then to be proclaimed Roman emperor. Um,
Wow.
so, that's of course totally bogus. No one in Constantinople was sitting there saying, "Oh my God, there's no
Right.
Roman Empire
Yeah,
anymore."
no, they're fine. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it would be crazy. It would be like if somebody in, I don't know, Albania were to say that the United States has ended because, this particular person took over. And everyone in the United States would be like, "What?"
Yeah,
That doesn't make any sense.
sure.
Um, but that actually sets up Charlemagne's proclamation as Roman emperor because there is no Roman emperor in the East. It sets up this tension between the Roman Empire in the West and the Roman Empire in the East that is mostly latent, but it allows for people in the West to dismiss the authority and the legitimacy of the empire in the East. And so what happens in 1204 is the Fourth Crusade actually acts on these ideas. Um, it acts on the idea first that this empire is not legitimate. And there's a coup that the Crusaders had participated in the year before that helps them make that claim. It also acts on this idea that because of the tensions between Eastern and Western Christendom, and then after 1054, the schism between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, you can claim that they're not really Christian anymore, or they're not Orthodox Christian anymore. And so what happens in 1204 is a Crusader army that is short on money decides that they can get money by sacking and capturing Constantinople. Um, the empire, if you think about it, they have invited these people in, right? It's not like they started at the border and fought all their way to the capital and
Yeah.
defeated the armies. The armies are nowhere near Constantinople because these are supposedly friendly forces.
Right.
Um, and so when they decide to attack in 1204, there's an army, in Epirus. There's an army in in Asia Minor. They're nowhere close to Constantinople because no one would imagine they needed to be close to Constantinople. And the Crusaders then break in, um, sack the city, enslave a lot of people, steal tons and tons of stuff. A lot of the most impressive medieval things in Venice are actually stolen from Constantinople. The
Wow.
horses in St. Mark, that comes from Constantinople. The porphyry tetrarchs at St. Mark from Constantinople.
Wow.
The what is it? The chancel screen that has all of these wonderful gold images of saints, stolen from Constantinople.
Wow.
Um, so this is it's a sneak attack, and it's really devastating. But when you read what they send home to the papacy, first of all, the initial reports don't tell the Pope what these people have actually done. They frame it as, well, we've reunified the East into a unified Christendom because now we control Constantinople, and then the Pope begins to hear about what actually happened, and he gets horrified. And one of the papal letters actually says, like, how are these people in the East ever going to trust us when all we have done is attack and destroy and capture and kill them? But the interesting thing for our question of, like, when did Rome fall, is when the city falls to the Crusaders. The main historian who talks about this is a man named Honiatus. And in Honianus's account of this, the emperor dies. The patriarch of Constantinople takes a member of an elite family and proclaims him emperor. And that person says, you know what? There is no empire anymore. There is a Roman people. And I'm going to lead the resistance of the Roman people, not as emperor, but as a leader of the Roman people. And the movement that he is part of ends up centering on the city of Nicaea. And that's the place from which the Greek-speaking Romans come and retake Constantinople from the Crusaders.
Hmm.
Is that a Roman state? Because if you listen to what is actually said in Honiatus's account, the Roman Empire fell in 1204.
Yeah.
The state isn't there, right? The people are there, but the state isn't anymore. But the Crusaders actually call themselves, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. To them, this is an assertion of continuity, right? To them, they probably wouldn't say that the empire fell. They just, are a new dynasty that took over.
Right.
But to the Greeks who had to, leave and live as refugees in Nicaea and reconquer the place, we do have one of them say in 1204 the empire ended.
How long did it take for them to come and get it back?
1261.
That's a long
So,
time.
yeah.
That's a life. That's like a generation,
Well, I think the way that we have to imagine it is the state's eviscerated, right? You have all of these military resources on the frontiers because that's where your armies are supposed to be. And so when the Crusaders come in, they come into the middle and they start taking this place apart from the middle.
Right.
And so it's very, very hard to, like, reintegrate a state when you just, like, tear the middle out of it. Oh, I was just going to say, like, the challenge then is, how do you move from the periphery and retake all that territory in the middle when the stuff in the middle is continually being reinforced from, like, France and Italy?
Right. And that's what I was going to say. I was going to ask, what do you think would have happened if they did align themselves together and actually do go and fight and conquer some of these Muslim territories? I mean, it must have been for them to decide to turn on their Greek neighbors and do that. That had to have been necessary at the time for whatever reason. But it almost makes you wonder, what if they didn't do that?
Yeah, I mean, that is such a disreputable thing because most of the crusades before that had traveled by land.
Yeah.
And so they would, and that was a problem too, because you would get these armies that would show up, like, in Bulgaria, and they'd have to walk through Byzantine territory. They would have to get moved across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. And these people, in some cases, are just, like, so naive about where they're going, right? These are knights from, like, northern France who are going to show up in full battle armor and fight in the summer in Syria. Like, right? Like, if you've ever been to, like, Rouen, imagine how, if you have never experienced a Syrian summer, how
Right.
you are going to react to that in
Yeah.
like heavy battle weapon, heavy battle armor and stuff. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
So that didn't work super well either. But what happened with this was the Fourth Crusade was supposed to go and attack Egypt. And so they had hired Venice to produce a flotilla of transport ships. And the Crusaders had effectively like pre-booked a certain number of passages on these ships. And then when they showed up in Venice, there's far fewer Crusaders. And so the Venetians say, well, you contracted for this, you got to pay for this. And the Crusaders had to effectively say, we don't have the money to pay for this because we have,
Wow.
half the people we expected. And so the Venetians say, okay, well, you can fight to pay off your debts. And so they go and attack a city in Croatia that the Crusaders take for the Venetians, and then the Venetians say, "Well, wait, that's not enough." And so there is a guy who's like a German prince who remembers that there is an exiled prince from Constantinople who's been hanging out at like Christmas parties in Germany and in Vienna, and has been like claiming that he's the legitimate Byzantine emperor. I bet if we restore him, he'll give us the money we need to pay off the Venetians. And so they bring this guy down from Germany. They bring him in. He orchestrates a coup. He gets made into he takes power in Constantinople, and then he realizes he can't pay them. And so the attack on Constantinople is their reaction to
That makes
him
sense.
saying, "I can't pay you."
And that's why
Uh,
you have all that stuff go to Venice.
yeah, yeah, because the Venetians get the biggest share.
Wow.
Um,
So fascinating.
it's it's just crazy
Yeah.
because it didn't need to be that way. And one of the biggest sources of tension between the Orthodox and Catholic world is that event. And that event, this is maybe a bigger historical point, but when you think about history, so many of the big turning points in history are caused by individuals making consequential decisions. And often those consequential decisions that affect millions and millions of people for hundreds and hundreds of years are based on like something so small as I'm angry with this person, or I'm insecure about getting the money I owe for someone else. It's a really This was a relatively small problem that has led to a really, really big shift in the way that, well, Europe is still working.
Did people respond to that as this is the end of Rome? Was that kind of the feeling or no?
Yeah, they kind of did.
Yeah.
They definitely felt this is the end of the East, the Eastern Empire. They felt that way in Constantinople. They felt. I'll amend that a little bit. There is this almost, I mean, legitimately, literally messianic thinking that's going on in Constantinople because the city is more or less impossible to conquer. It was even going back to before it was Constantinople. So in the around 200 AD, the Emperor Septimius Severus tries to take this place, and they hold out for the better part of a year, even though it's a really tiny place. And he has the whole imperial army, and it is just like a city holding out against him. They hold out for a really long time. Um, Constantine recognized the strategic benefit of this place and began fortifying it. And then in the 5th century, it was fortified with walls that 1,000 years later are state of the art. So it is. One of my friends, I think Caldalis, has said, there's three types of cities in the Middle Ages. There's unfortified cities, there's fortified cities, and there's Constantinople. Because Constantinople is really impenetrable. And there are moments when this place should have fallen, right? In 626, a normal city would have fallen because it was besieged by Avars on one side, Persians on the other. The naval approaches are cut off, the land approaches are cut off, and it survives this one. It is besieged by Arabs for more than a year between 717 and 718. Again, they make it through. So 1204 is really exceptional in part
Sure.
because the walls had already been damaged, right? In the coup, they weren't rebuilt. Second, the army had been able to get there. There wasn't any real defensive ability to fight back against the Crusaders because they weren't expected to be a threat.
Yeah.
And then in 1261, the city is taken back by the Byzantines almost by accident, right? Like they have a kind of guy who opens the gates for them, more or less. So when this falls in 1453, it's actually thought to be more or less impossible. There was a Byzantine defeat of an Ottoman siege earlier, where the Ottomans had overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower, and they didn't take it. And so for Byzantines, for people in Constantinople in May of 1453, the scene is so difficult for a modern person to imagine, because the city's footprint is for a city of 500,000 people, but there's maybe 15,000 people living in it at that point.
Yeah.
And so when the walls were built, like the city went to the walls. You see these pictures of Constantinople in the 1430s or 1440s, and there's orchards and windmills and stuff, like all of this kind of countryside inside the walls before you actually get to where any people are living. And so when the Turks break through, and then they move pretty quickly through the city before they're hitting people. There's this idea in Constantinople that the Turks will get as far as the Column of Constantine. That's basically like right where the Grand Bazaar is right now in Istanbul. And then an angel is going to show up. And this is what they literally believed. An angel will show up, push the Turks out of Constantinople, push them out of all of the Roman lands that are in the east, push them all the way back to Persia, and restore the Roman Empire as it was under, at its peak. And they really believe this. And so when the Turks get to the Column of Constantine and no angel shows up, people are legitimately, they don't know what to do, right? Because they just believed that their state was not going to fall. Like God was going to step in and it would be saved.
Is it true that there was a blood moon that weekend?
I don't know.
I saw that
because
Netflix has a documentary about Mehmed II conquering it, and I think it was one of the professors that they were interviewing was said something about that there was a blood moon. People were freaked out. People were fleeing because they thought it was but who knows if that's true or not. But I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that. But yeah.
No, I don't know for sure. It's totally possible though.
Yeah, I mean, possible. Yeah.
There's another great story that when the Turks get to Hagia Sophia, there is like an emperor, somebody who goes into the walls, who will emerge from the walls again when the city is liberated. But yeah, in the West too, it's a shock that Constantinople fell. They really didn't think it was possible.
Was the Catholic Church or papal states, I should say, were the papal states trying to help out against the Muslim, or were they just letting it all go down?
They tried. I mean, after the council in 1439, they do mount a crusade. It doesn't get through Hungary. It gets just destroyed. There is Piccolomini, again, our favorite guy, who thought that you could maybe convert Mehmed. Piccolomini tries to organize another crusade, and it just doesn't go anywhere. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, he tries to organize something. It doesn't go anywhere. Charles V thought that he could get to Constantinople, and he actually does conquer Tunis. And in the triumph that he celebrated for the victory in Tunis, there's a mass held in Santa Maria Maggiore where the Pope says, next year we're going to celebrate Mass in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. That didn't happen. Yeah, so there is this idea that we need to do something. We need to do something. We need to do something for the better part of 100 years. But the Ottomans are, they're no joke. It's not like you can just march in there and knock out the Ottomans. So talking about it and doing it are very different things. And some people were smart enough to realize that, but on occasion, some people weren't smart enough to realize that, tried and didn't get anywhere, because you really are not going to make much without really a lot of resources and a lot of determination. That's just not going to happen against the Ottomans in the 15th, 16th, 17th century.
Yeah, and then just turns out that by the end of that century, going into the 16th century, you have now a new world to look at. Now we found new land over there. Let's focus. Now the whole Latin world's focused on the West now. It seems like it's like, all right, we lost the East. It's over. And after
Well,
that, that's the end. Or unless I'm wrong,
they get there, but the war against Tunis is actually funded by silver from Peru. So Charles V is able to mount these campaigns against the Ottomans in the Mediterranean using money taken from the Americas.
That's fascinating.
And so that's like where this intersection becomes so seriously complicated, right? Like this idea of like what Rome is and where Rome goes and what the relationship of the Roman past to the Roman present is, it becomes a worldwide thing in the 16th century. Like people are dying in Peru, so Charles can go and invade Tunisia with an army from Spain and a navy from Italy, right? Like it is really, really deeply connected.
Wow. Yeah, you have the whole most of the Americas is Spanish speaking, or Portuguese, or it's Catholic churches. Well, now it's starting to be more Protestants, but for a while it was like the Catholic Empire was all the way, like, and that just made, and it's interesting that you said that they were funding wars against the Ottomans, but if I'm not mistaken, right after Constantinople fell, wasn't the Ottomans trying to set their sights on Rome as Italy actually, or does that not happen?
There are some Ottoman penetrations in Italy. Like for a little while, the Ottomans do maintain a little bit of a toehold, like in Otranto, in the very sort of eastern part of the heel of the boot. Um, and there are Ottoman raids all over the Western Mediterranean.
Wow.
I'm trying to think. I think there's so after the conquest of Tunisia, there's an Ottoman raid in Majorca. I think it's Majorca. But there's an Ottoman raid in the Balearic Islands that is really devastating. I mean, it is just a reprisal. And it actually causes huge problems for Charles V because uh, the campaign in Tunisia, so Charles V's territory is the stuff he controls is crazy because he controls the Holy Roman Empire, he controls the Low Countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, he controls part of what's now modern France, he controls Spain, he controls the Spanish Empire in the Americas. He's also the king of Naples. Um, and so the campaign that he launches against Tunisia, he's using Peruvian precious metals to fund a Spanish army to fight a campaign that's benefiting his Italian lands. And what the Ottomans understand is you can actually split this coalition if this campaign that benefited his Italian subjects is used as a pretext to punish his Spanish subjects. And so they attack the Balearics to make the Spanish upset that he's using Spanish troops and the Spanish American Empire to help Italy.
Wow.
And it works really, really well. So the Ottomans are they're very capable of they can't really take territory in the Balearics, but they can make a lot of trouble for people in the Western Mediterranean. And they attack in southern France and in Provence, and they do attack in parts of Italy. They have that capacity, but they aren't really reaching the point where they have the capacity to conquer large swaths of territory on the north side, the northwestern part of the Mediterranean.
That's fascinating. Now, my last question for you is: do you see any comparison between the new American uh, 13 states compared to, let's say, Athenian democracy or even the Roman Republic?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that when the founding fathers are sitting down to think about the structure of the state, the nation that they're creating, what they realize is it is too big a place to run like an Athenian democracy because Athenian democracy required as many people as possible to get together and make decisions collectively. And you couldn't do it where people were not showing up. But the Roman Republic was based on this idea of representatives who were chosen to craft and then execute policy. And the number of people who selected those representatives did expand numerically and geographically for a very long time. So when the Republic starts, Rome probably controls territory that's, I don't know, I use my frame of reference, maybe about the size of San Diego. By the time it ends, it controls, by the time of Augustus, it controls the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po, with citizens, right? It controls other territory, but everybody living south of the Po is a Roman citizen who has the ability to vote for magistrates, and those magistrates can craft policy. And I think when the founding fathers looked at the 13 colonies and realized, the diversity of needs and experiences between somewhere like New Hampshire and Georgia is so great, that the only way you can make this thing work is if you have representatives from all of those places who come together. And the other thing they looked at is, the American colonies had just started exploiting land on the other side of the Appalachians. So they were looking to expand. And the Roman Republic gives you a model for not only a representative democracy for an existing state, but a representative democracy that has the capacity to expand. And so I think when they saw the Roman Republic, what they saw was a structure that could be adapted and kind of updated for 18th century reality that actually worked really, really well for what America was and what it was going to become. And so I think that's probably the way we have to imagine them working from, is this is a way to build a kind of common consensus about what's good for a society, what's lawful about a society, and what a diverse group of people living in a diverse set of environments need to collectively come together to make decisions that benefit as many people as possible, while that population expands and those environments, expand. And the Roman Republic is probably, if you want a representative state that works in that way, the best thing that they had in the 18th century to look at.
Wow. So is it safe to say that Roman culture, the genes are still around? Like the genes never die out or fall. It's just it transforms. This idea of what Rome is constantly transforming throughout the years, and it's more or less it's more like a, how do I say it? It's not like a solid. It's more like a liquid. It's like flowing into
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. I think that's actually perfect, because one of the things I tell my students every time I start a Roman history class is this is a state that starts out as Latin-speaking pagans on hills in central Italy, and it ends up, Latin-speaking pagans in the Bronze Age living on hills in central Italy, and it ends up Greek-speaking Christians in Constantinople with gunpowder. How do you do that? Right? There's something that they're doing that is exactly, I think, as you encapsulated it. This is liquid. This is a very fluid kind of people and state and political system that is able to adapt very easily and very well to all of the conditions it faces. And because of that, where you start and where you end look absolutely nothing like each other. But I think that's why it's appealing to us, because again, like any story you want to tell, you can find something in Rome that's going to help you understand it.
Well said. I have links in the description for your channel and your links for Amazon. And thank you for your time. And you have just attained true gnosis.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.